All right. Now I'd like to welcome to the show my distinguished colleague and author of the recent study, The Forgotten History of the Wagner Act, Sean Higgins. Welcome to Free the Economy, Sean.
Glad to be here.
All right. So we're here to talk about labor unions and the American workforce. Now, the top story right now out there in America is about the strike of the United Auto Workers against the big three car makers, which these days are Ford, GM, and Stellantis, which now owns Chrysler. So you recently wrote about how this is an odd sort of strike in a way, because although the action is getting a lot of attention, certainly, it's not really a full work stoppage like a traditional strike. So what's the status of what's going on with the UAW strike?
They've been striking for about 4 weeks now. Only about 1/6 of the UAW members that work for automakers, it's about 150,000 total, but only about 25,000 people are actually on picket lines. And there's a threat that they may increase that, but they haven't actually done it. So it's a strike, yet the vast majority of the auto workers are still going to their regular jobs and doing them as if they ordinarily were, which is contrary to the whole common understanding of what a strike is in the first place. And the reason for this is that the union literally just doesn't have the money for a full-on work stoppage at all the automakers simultaneously. They use what's called a strike fund, which is what they pay their members while they're on strike, so they can get by without a paycheck. But it's only about $500 a week. It's not that much, and if they were to do a full stoppage, they would probably burn through that in about 2 months. This sort of partial stoppage is their attempt to stretch out the strike fund as long as they can. They're in the hopes that if they pinpoint a few particular important plants, then they can do more damage that way. But it's not really working. It's This type of strategy works with things like the airline industry, which is very has where logistics are a very important part, and sudden stoppages in work in particular places can cause cascading problems through the system. But the auto industry just isn't as vulnerable in that way.
Well, that seems almost like the idea of the filibuster in Congress, where a real filibuster is where someone stands up on the floor and they talk for 24 hours and actually stop things from happening. But in reality, like in the U.S. Senate, that's really just a threat of a filibuster, right? And this is seems like this is more of a threat of a real strike rather than what we think of as a traditional full strike.
Yeah, that's a good way of characterizing it, I think. Yes.
So, a lot of people have been talking about the demands that the UAW has and how they are pretty dramatic, right? And would represent a significant increase in the total cost to car makers, and the when we calculate the cost per hour on average of work for unionized workers in car manufacturing facilities, it would be a significant increase over the long term. And whether or not that's actually sustainable, whether these three companies could afford to do that at all, or if they agreed to all of the UAW demands, whether they simply would go bankrupt in a matter of a few years. Do you think the UAW demands, the public demands they've made so far, are for real, or are they just sort of an opening gambit, and that they're planning on compromising at some point because they know the car makers couldn't actually meet their true demands?
It must be the latter, because I mean, you never in any negotiation, you never open with your closing bid or your bottom line bid. You always ask for more than you can reasonably get, and scale down from there. That's how you sort of get what you actually want and what you can reasonably expect. And you always make you so that's the situation there. The problem the auto industry has is that when we say big three, we don't really, that doesn't have the sort of importance that it used to. I mean, domestic auto manufacturers, Ford, GM, and Stellantis only make 40% of the domestically produced cars in the U.S. Other brands, Toyota, Volkswagen, and such, they have factories in the U.S. and they make the remaining 60% or so of the vehicles, and those are mostly non-union plants in places like Tennessee and South Carolina and elsewhere. Um, so they're, the automakers are in serious competition, with these other automakers, and a really high labor cost just puts them in a very strong disadvantage. On top of that, they're trying to make the transition to electronic vehicles, which is something the administration is pushing very hard. And the thing about electronic vehicles is that they don't require as much labor to produce. And not only that, but they can't be produced in the same factories in the same way. They're going to have to, for example, produce the batteries in separate facilities. And that means that so some of the workers in the factories in the Detroit, Ohio, Rust Belt area may have to be moved elsewhere, which is one of the other things that the union is trying to prevent, because factories are moved to right to work states, then the union has a weaker hold on its members, so they're trying to prevent that from happening. The UAW is in a very difficult position in these negotiations, and it's just doing the most it can to sort of limit the damage and bleeding that they're facing. One of the interesting things about this is that while they know the EV vehicle transition is going to cost the union substantially, they're not really fighting that. They seem to view it as a fait accompli that's just going to happen, and they have to accept it. And the other thing to note is that when we say the United Auto Workers, a lot of their members aren't auto workers anymore. I mean, they've made substantial expansions into education. UAW represents a lot of college assistants and teaching assistants and people in the education world. And in fact, it's growing to the point where they may actually eclipse the number of automakers that are members of the UAW.
Hmm.
So to a certain extent, they don't need auto jobs. The United Auto Workers doesn't need auto jobs as much as it used to, as bizarre as that may sound.
So, you mentioned the fact that ultimately companies do have some choice over where they locate their facilities, and whether they're in a state like Michigan or Ohio, or whether it's a state like South Carolina or Alabama. Do you think this is just going to push the big manufacturers like the big three car companies to want to open more facilities in Tennessee and South Carolina and Alabama, or even down in Mexico, where their assembly plants have been assembly plants for years down there?
That's been the trend for the last couple of decades, and I see no reason why it would shift. I mean, unions have fought this in various ways. They've attempted to organize the facilities in the South. They've attempted to roll back the right to work laws in those states. They've done various different things. They've attempted to force at various times manufacturers from opening new factories there. It wasn't the auto industry, but it was Boeing that had a very difficult fight in attempting to open some facilities in South Carolina, which was deemed anti-worker for the basic fact that they acknowledged that one of the reasons why they were going there was because of the different union laws related there. So the unions have been just sort of fighting this trend in every way they can over the last couple of decades. But it's one of those things where capitalism will do what it can to sort of minimize costs and allocate things more efficiently. And as long as these laws exist, this trend is going to continue.
Right. You mentioned the EV transition, electric vehicle transition, that the current administration, of course, is pushing pretty strongly. You've got increased oomph from Congress in passing long-term credits for purchase of electric vehicles, like $7,500 per car. But one of the angles of analysis I've been hearing is that if the companies were to give the UAW even a lot of what they want, assuming they wouldn't get all of what they want, that it would be so expensive that the auto companies wouldn't have the money to invest in EV technology and changing facilities and updating facilities to catch up with Tesla and the Chinese car companies. And when it comes to advanced manufacturing of electric motors and batteries, like General Motors, for example, has said that they're going to go all EV, right? They're going to spend $35 billion to go all EV by 2035. Could this be a sort of Pyrrhic victory by the union if they get a bunch of concessions and wage increases, but they hobble these companies so bad that they can't compete on EVs?
I think it would, but I just don't think they're going to get those concessions. I mean, think ultimately, I mean, the manufacturers are just going to say, look, we just can't afford what you're claiming, despite the arguments that you're making. The reality is, labor costs that high are just going to, as you say, push out, the money for other investment in modernization and the ability to sort of make these vehicles. They are in tough competition with other manufacturers to produce these vehicles, and if they can't put them out and make them attractive to consumers, in which they may not be able to do under the circumstances that the auto UAW is requesting, then I mean the opposite. It's the automakers to a certain extent just don't have a choice. If they're going to continue to survive, they need to economize and be able to do these things, and the union needs to recognize that. The problem with the UAW is it still sort of operates from the perspective that it is the only thing, it and the big three are the only things that sort of matter in the US. And they constantly never really fully accepted the fact that how competitive the automobile industry has become in the US. And they still sort of look back to their glory days in the mid 20th century. And that economy just doesn't exist anymore.
Well, yeah, I'm thinking about the other unacknowledged player in the room, right? So you have the UAW and the big three, and the fight is always between management and labor, classic industrial labor union way. But if you go back to between 10 and 15 years ago, during the Obama years, you had this situation where you had the Great Recession and you had GM was about to sort of like go out of existence, right? And so then you had the feds came in and made investment, and they brokered this deal where the union accepted wage concessions. And do you think it's possible that we'll face a sort of like crisis where the GM or all three of them will be facing such problems that the federal government will feel the need to intervene and broker some sort of emergency deal a la the Obama administration deal?
We're not there yet. I mean, I don't see it as impossible on the horizon. Maybe after the next election, whenever this current strike is settled and the big three get into sort of attempting to manufacture these cars under this new economic contract, collective bargaining contracts they have, they may actually fall into that situation. Now, who is president then, and whether that administration is open to sort of bailing out the administration the way of the administration, the industry the way Obama did in the decade or so ago, is a big question. I mean, God only knows who's going to be president in 2 years. And, he could be in a world of hurt one way or the other, depending upon who the voters choose. So yeah, I mean, I think your scenario is entirely possible that they may feel as though they could, or the government may feel as though it should. Whether it will have the political, there will be the administration sympathetic to doing that is not clear. One other point I'd like to make is that the threat of bankruptcy that existed in the during the Obama administration that led to this sort of bailout. People have a misunderstanding of what bankruptcy means in this context. People assume it means the same thing as like a personal bankruptcy, where or if it's a small business, it's just literally wiped out overnight. If the big three were to go bankrupt, they would cease to exist as sort of the corporations as we knew them, but the factories would still exist, the workers would still exist, the market for the vehicles that they produce would still exist. The other manufacturers would come in, they would purchase these assets, they would hire these workers because they're highly skilled workers that are hard to find. And they would produce these cars in exchange. So it's not as though all these people would lose their jobs. It's not as though these cars wouldn't be made. It would shift, it would change. It would not be what we were previously, but it wouldn't simply vanish overnight, the way people seem to think they would.
Right. I think that's actually a really important point about corporate bankruptcies, where people hear bankruptcy and they think liquidation, right?
Right.
That
Exactly.
everything just sort of like disappears. Whereas some of our most famous and popular and successful corporations have in the past gone through bankruptcy protection procedures that usually involves the people who hold their debt being, getting a haircut, as they say, having to, accept less in terms of debt repayment and refinancing.
And the reason why unions hate those things is one of the things that gets tossed out and can be completely redone in the bankruptcy reshuffling is a collective bargaining contract. So they stand to lose what they've argued for and against. That's the reason why. In fact, during the Obama bailout of the auto industry, I mean, the UAW was right behind that and supportive of that for the most part.
So speaking of who might be president in the future and what position government policy is going to have on disputes like this, a lot of what's going on in the industry does in fact depend on government policy. Things like we talked about subsidies for electric vehicles and things like made in the USA requirements, which are of course of particular interest to unions, but also the general stance of government towards labor unions overall. Now, you've written some fascinating historical analysis here about the relationship between specifically the federal government and organized labor, and the question of should government agencies and should the federal government be pro-union explicitly, or should it just be there to sort of set a level playing field? Tell us about the history of that.
Yeah, the thing about to back up for those of you watching this who aren't familiar with it, the main federal law covering unions is called the National Labor Relations Act. It's passed in 1935. It was in fact a piece of fix-it legislation because 2 years previous, there had been a New Deal legislation called the National Industrial Recovery Act, which included collective bargaining rights in it. However, that law was not very well written, and they didn't really have a whole good understanding of exactly how to implement it. And the ironic result of this was a lot of manufacturers decided, well, if we're supposed to have unions, then we'll just create unions and make our workers join the unions, and therefore we'll have unions. And these unions, of course, were answerable to the management of the company, which was an obvious conflict of interest that prevented them from being very effective. At the same time, a lot of existing unions, because they were now legal under federal law, made a renewed push to try and force a lot of manufacturers to have unions. And there was a lot of strikes, there were a lot of riots. National Guard were called out in places. I mean, dozens, scores, I think maybe even hundreds of people died in some of these riots. It got really bloody in 1934. It was a horrible year in terms of labor unrest. And the point of the National Labor Relations Act was to address these two things, to sort of stop these strikes that were really snaring up entire industries, and to ensure that workers had collective bargaining rights, but that they had collective bargaining rights in a way that ensured that they were real and substantial and they could actually gain concessions from management. And the author of the law, author of the new law, was a senator named Robert Wagner. And the way he sort of threaded this needle, at least as he explained it during the congressional hearings for the legislation, was that this was ensuring individual rights to join a union. In other words, the union could exist and the workers could have the rights, but it had to be voluntary on the part of the workers. They couldn't be coerced into doing it as the manufacturers were doing it. Manufacturers were making them do this. So, and he made it quite clear that the government was therefore a neutral sort of umpire in determining whether a union was real, and that the union had to have this sort of affirmative consent of the workers to exist. Unfortunately, because they were also trying to address this issue with these massive riots and the bloodiness of it, they did say in the law that the policy of the government shall be to encourage unions in the case of these substantial disturbances. And that context has been lost, and people such as the Biden administration and a lot of labor leaders now just sort of look at that one thing in isolation and say, well, the law says the government should be encouraging people into unions. And the reason why this is significant is because most of the laws and the rules and regulations that have been put forward in the last 2 decades to sort of amend or update labor law have all been about giving unions more power to force individual workers to fall into line. Things like card check, things like the PRO Act, they're all basically about giving the union leaders more power to just automatically form unions and get them arguing, and not to give the individual workers the right to decide whether or not they want to belong, what they want to do. But one of the major problems that the union movement has is just a sort of lack of grassroots democracy. The union leaders get elected, they basically decide the policy, and they oblige their members to go along and get along. And I think this is the reason why they struggle sometimes to recruit members. A lot of people, I think, are very sort of resentful of what their leadership does, or they just don't know what the leadership is doing. And if it were more grassroots oriented, it would be more reflective of the actual wills of the workers. I think they do a better job of getting concessions from the management and understanding what the workers really need and want. Anyway, that's my soapbox for it.
And so, but with this understanding, this sort of, what we call it sort of an ahistorical understanding that the federal government should be actively encouraging unionization all the time. A lot of Democratic politicians have been running with that and saying, well, the reason why we're rolling out this new program or why we have this new, administrative rule that we're proposing is because it's part of the responsibility of the government to facilitate unionization. And if you read some of this gets into very kind of dry technical stuff. But if you read some of these proposed rules, they'll have what they call the preamble, which is like the long description of why this government agency is proposing a new rule before you get to the details. And sometimes it will specifically say this is here to support organized labor and unions, even if it's not a labor policy. So there's a sort of idea that like every new government initiative has to have some pro-labor union sweetener kind of like woven into it, and that's not only legitimate, but that's what we should be doing, right? Because everything has to be, the federal government has to be pro-union all the time, and digging like you've done, digging back into what people actually said in 1935, which everyone seems to have forgotten about, is kind of an important reminder that no, the government is supposed to be neutral. It's just supposed to allow you to make that choice. It's not supposed to be constantly putting its thumb on the scale with every policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a substantial rhetorical advantage to the sort of pro-labor side in these sort of policy discussions if they can simply say, well, the law says we should be encouraging unions. And if you just sort of let that stand, that's a big win for them, at least in terms of the intellectual argument and the debate of where the policy should go. And if you can say, no, that's not what the law says, and that's not what the intention behind the law was, and here's why. You can start a debate over that, then we can get to a better understanding of, what a union should be and what the government policy should be. I mean, I'm pro-union myself in the sense of it is an absolute right of workers to collectively bargain. I mean, that's part of the First Amendment's right of association. The point of it is, though, is that it should be, the voluntary belief of all the workers. It should be, what each worker should be there because they want to be there, not because they've been forced to be there. And this is the problem that so often is the case.
And so I wonder what a lot of this means for the future of unions long term in the United States. A lot of people in recent years have, of course, observed that private sector unions have been in decline for a long time. What we think of the traditional unions, which is the like heavy manufacturing and things like that, the iron workers and all those guys that were the sort of vanguard of unionization in the early 20th century. A lot of those unions have been in serious decline. And the real growth in unionization has been public sector unions. This is government employees, right? They're stronger than ever, and this, which is a sort of like a strange kind of mismatch in the way that, excuse me, traditionally, I think even now, a lot of people still think about what unions are and what they're for. And to me, this is kind of highlighted with the sort of handful of exceptions in unionization that have been celebrated the past few years, in which you have things like, a tiny handful of people who work for an online magazine, formed a union or, joined the Communications Workers of America or something. People were really excited when Wirecutter, the like consumer product review section of New York Times had it, unionized, which is great if those people, those few dozen people voted to join a union if they wanted to, but that's not exactly the revival of the great American labor movement that people in the movement would want to see. So I wonder, where do you see all this going? Are we still going to continue this long sort of glide path of fewer industrial workers actually joining unions? That's even putting to the side the fact that the U.S. economy in general has moved from a sort of like goods to a services model, but are we going to have a situation where it's sort of only the teachers and the police officers are the only big unions left standing?
Not necessarily. Your broader review of it is correct. I mean, we've seen, for example, decline in strength of unions in industrial sectors and manufacturing, which used to be the backbone. But that's because those sectors now employ a lot fewer people. I mean, there's just a lot more automation, and we don't produce everything in the U.S. now. We import more stuff. So, I mean, that's just the sort of natural consequence of that. The growth in public sector unions, that's a function of the fact that they just have an inherent advantage over private sector unions. The public sector is not going to go bankrupt if you demand too much. And the union members are also constituents of whoever they're negotiating with ultimately. So they have more, they get more sympathy and better deal out of their putative management for that reason. So they have that advantage. And in terms of things like you're talking about, like the small discrete niche things that have suddenly been unionized in years, that's an interesting trend, and I think we'll start to see more of that in the coming years. I mean, there's always going to be a need for workers to have a way to address grievances to management and demand more than what they currently have. And there's what's called a quote alt labor movement, which is the attempt to sort of figure out how to organize people in these sort of new and emerging industries. One of the main problems that the union movement has had is that it hasn't kept pace with the emergence of new industries and new technologies and new ways of working. And this was trying to figure out how to do that. I mean, the interesting fact is the absolute headcount number of unionized workers in the U.S. has actually remained remarkably stable since the 1950s. It's just that the population has grown and the economy has grown around it, and the unions haven't grown along with that. Now, we're seeing some friction as far as that goes, because there's a lot of activity now of attempting to organize the quote unquote gig economy workers, which is just gig economy just being another more modern term for freelancer. There's always been there's certain professions in the past that were just understood that you work from gig to gig and job to job. That's where, I mean, gigging as in gigging musician, that's where the word comes from. But also things like freelance journalism, freelance photographer, that type of stuff. But we're now seeing an expansion of that type of model into a lot of other fields. And labor unions are having a damned time sort of dealing with that, because they don't really know how to organize those models, because they confound most of the ordinary ways in which workers can be organized and the ways in which the law addresses those workers. And their action is basically to try and force gig workers into the old sort of system, and that doesn't really work. I mean, if you can't organize people if they're not all basically in the same place at the same time and they know each other and they can act that way. If it's a dispersed group of people, over doing different things, not necessarily interacting with each other, you're going to have a very hard time organizing those people just for that simple reason. But there are making attempts and they're trying new things. And the interesting thing is, the rise of social media gives an alternate way to sort of organize and reach out to people. And I think you're starting to see some of that. I mean, the other interesting thing is we're seeing a sort of pendulum swing back and forth, because for a long time, if you weren't in a union yourself, you probably had a sister or a cousin or an aunt or an uncle or somebody like that who worked in a union and would tell you what it was like, and you sort of understood what a union was from that sort of cultural osmosis, for lack of a better phrase that I could think of. And nowadays, there's a lot of talk about unions, but most people don't have any experience or understanding of what they are. They only sort of hear this sort of this spiel from the pro-union side, which is a very idealized vision of what a union is and what it could do for them. But since that's all they hear and they don't have any experience contrary, they assume that that's the way it is. And so you're seeing a lot of people, I mean, there's a lot of polls that show that unions are more popular. And I think they're more popular because they're theoretical and that people only sort of understand this sort of idealized vision of what's being presented. But that does mean I think a lot more people are going to experiment with them and try different models. So we'll see some interesting things come out of that.
Well, yeah, the other sort of wrinkle here, again, in terms of like government policies, what we might see in the future from Republican policy. So traditionally, the short, dumb version of the scenario is that Democrats are always pro-union and Republicans are always anti-union, and that's the the expectation of those two parties. In the last few years, especially, you've had more Republicans, more self-identified conservatives who's more on the sort of populist or the nationalist side, who say that Republicans should actually be Republicans should be the party of the working man, and they've tried to say the Democrats are now the party of the college educated elite, and that there are at least a handful of recognized Republican politicians who are really focusing on saying, the Republican Party should have pro-worker policies, but what would they be, right? Given the historic kind of antagonism between conservatives and Republicans and organized labor, and the fact that the vast majority of organized labor donations certainly go to Democratic politicians, what do you think is the possibility there? Because if we had, say, obviously the political pendulum is swinging all the time. We could have at some point in the not too distant future a Republican trifecta. Imagine we had a House and a Senate and a White House that were all controlled by Republicans, and the question of labor policy comes up. What would they do?
Yeah, I mean, it's again interesting because as you say, at least in recent decades, the assumption is that the labor movement is a solidly liberal wing uh, of our culture, and therefore part of the Democratic Party, and Republicans can only sort of nip away at that. That's broadly true, but it's hard to actually know what the numbers are because they don't actually reliably, for whatever reason, they don't reliably poll union members in exit polls. So we don't really know how they vote or what they do. One of the important things to know is that a lot of people are union members. They're not necessarily union members because that's what they ideally want to do. It's because they're, wherever they work was already unionized when they got there, and they were obligated to join the union as part of the job. They don't necessarily vote, quote unquote, a union line. And union leaders have acknowledged this. The AFL-CIO does polling, but they don't actually release most of it publicly. So, but they've indicated at times that their members don't actually vote the way their leaders always tell them to do. So there's that factor. Trump supposedly does better among unionized voters than other Republicans, but again, we don't really know how precisely he does that. He does, however, have the interesting fact of, he's in his 70s and he has this sort of more romanticized view of unions than other Republicans do. He talks about them in that way. And, culturally speaking, unions have been all over the map in the last, century or so. In the 50s and 60s, they were actually a very small C conservative force in America, popular culture, very sort of conservative in that sense. A lot of union leaders and a lot of union members were very much against the counterculture in the 60s upheavals. That's sort of where you get the Archie Bunker hard hat stereotype. And the Teamsters and other groups actually supported Nixon and came out against McGovern in the 90s. But that was, again, a mostly sort of cultural reactionary thing. In terms of labor policy, I think the Republicans can win them over and build more support among unions if they simply stand for policies that grow the economy and ensure more jobs in general. I mean, that's ultimately what people want. They want jobs. The rising tide that lifts all boats and the rising wages is something that just appeals to all workers, period, whether they're union or not. And in terms of the unions, there's always going to be that element of them that's sort of left labor socialist in the sort of small s sense. But again, as I said, that is the right of the workers to do that and to demand more from their employers. And I think a policy that just sort of acknowledges that and puts more of a stress on labor peace and finding equitable ways to work out these things could be useful. In terms of whether or not Republicans should support more workers being in unions, what they should do is they should support the right of the workers to make up their own minds and make up their own choices. Don't knee-jerkily oppose unions simply because they exist. Those are workers and those are potential voters and supporters. At the same time, recognize that unions don't always represent the will of the workers that they claim to either. So don't necessarily be afraid to stand up to them.
All right, sounds like a solid agenda. Well, thank you, Sean, for being with us. It's been a great conversation. I think we all learned a lot today.
Okay, I hope.
And where can people find your work and find you online?
Well, just like they can find you, I'm at cei.org, and all my stuff is right there. centrally located.
All right, and are you on Twitter? Can people find you there?
I'm on Twitter, but honestly, I'm not a big fan of it. I wasn't a fan of it even before Elon Musk got involved, and I'm not so much now. But I have a presence on it, yes.
All right. Thanks,
Sean
Sean.
G. Higgins is if you're looking me up.
Find him. Until next time.